Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Talia Marcheggiani. I'm recording to you guys from my home in Toronto, Ontario. I'm a naturopathic doctor and I work in Bloris Wellness. And this video is inspired by a few things that crossed my news feed and my social media in the last few weeks. The first being the news reports about a study that was done by the American Heart Association that warns us about the dangers of coconut oil in raising our LDL cholesterol and thereby contributing to an increased risk of heart disease. Another thing was the documentary What the Health that's airing on Netflix. It's one of the trending videos on Netflix right now. And some of the claims in What the Health are that refined sugar is fine, and there's no connection between refined sugar and diabetes, and that it's actually meat and protein and animal products that contribute to rising increases in diabetes. So there's a lot of conflict out there, and it's very confusing for a lot of people because 1 second eggs are something you should avoid because they're cholesterol content. The next second eggs are good for you and have healthy fats and you shouldn't worry about your dietary cholesterol. 1 second you should be avoiding salts if you have high blood pressure. And the next second, the totality of evidence is showing us that there's no connection between salt in your diet and overall impact on blood pressure. And then now we have this debate about refined sugar and which fats are healthy for us and which fats aren't. And one of the things that people were writing in the reports that were reporting back about the American Heart Association study was that, we should be avoiding saturated fats and we should be consuming fats like canola oil and vegetable oils. And I think they even mentioned margarine as a healthy fat. And that's super confusing to people because for the last few decades we've been talking about how those inflammatory omega-6 fats are things that we should avoid, especially those processed seed oils like canola, corn, soy oil, and especially hydrogenated oils like margarine. How are we supposed to figure out what to eat, what foods to put in our bodies? We understand that over time we approximate the truth with scientific research, but we have to decide what to eat today, and we have to probably eat about 3 meals today, and hopefully we're choosing foods to incorporate into those meals that are going to promote our health longevity and increase the likelihood of us living longer and disease-free for as long as possible. And how are we supposed to make those decisions if we have no idea what's true and what's false and what foods are good for us? In the scientific methods of nutritional research, we can understand a little bit about why there's so much conflicting evidence and why there's so many conflicting conclusions that we can draw from looking at these large studies of populations. So first of all, how we study nutrition is we look at populations of people and we see what diseases they're most likely to get. So we look at the French and their intake of saturated fats and their consumption of red wine, and then we look at their incidences of heart disease. We see that that's less than those of North America. And so then we start to draw conclusions and extrapolate information from the data, or we look at populations like the Inuit and how they consume a very high fat diet, very little fruits and vegetables, and we look at their incidences of disease and things like diabetes and heart disease and autoimmune diseases. And so obviously these are flawed studies because we're looking at different populations that have adapted to a certain diet and a certain environment and who live very differently than we do in North America. We're mostly sedentary. We're not obtaining our foods directly from the environment, but from grocery stores and farmers, and there's industrialization of the food that we're eating. And so we can't simply extrapolate a diet that the Inuit eat and then adapt that same diet in North America with our lifestyles and our variation in genetics and things like that. But it can tell us something about how a population that eats a very high-fat diet is not necessarily going to get the same diseases that we think are connected to high-fat diets. And then the second way that we look at nutritional evidence is through epidemiological studies. So these are big studies that follow people for decades, and they check in periodically with them. They see what diseases they got, they do health checks on them and see what their blood markers are for cholesterol and things like that, and they check in with what their lifestyle involves. And so they'll evaluate their diets through something called food frequency questionnaires. And food frequency questionnaires is one way that diet is assessed. And so people will be given a questionnaire and they'll be asked, how often do you eat something like chicken? Or it might be even broader, it might be a food group in general, like animal products. And they'll be asked to rate their frequency from none to 6 or more times a week. And so you can imagine the the flaw and the inaccuracy in a measure like this. So one thing I do on an initial intake with my patients is I'll ask them to give me a 24-hour diet recall, where they'll tell me what they had in the last 24 hours and approximate the times that they had those foods. And it's really difficult to kind of track back through your day, and that's just the day before. So when I'm asking you to give me a bird's eye view of your diet and tell me how often you eat chicken, I mean, most of us are probably going to say like 3 times a week, 6 times a week. It's very difficult to pinpoint that with a degree of accuracy. Another flaw with those epidemiological studies is that we're establishing correlations, and correlation doesn't always equate to causation. So if we find that people that consumed more sugar had an increased rate of diabetes, which is conflicting in these epidemiological studies, so we can't actually draw out that evidence necessarily. There are some studies that show that there is a connection between high sugar intake and higher incidence of diabetes, and then there's also studies that don't show a link. And so how can we, if we were using science to get the truth, how can these studies show such vastly differing results? And so the thing with the correlative studies is that two things can be correlated that may not be related at all, or there may be this hidden factor that connects the two of them. So there's a correlation between ice cream consumption and drowning. So you could extract from that if you eat ice cream, you're more likely to drown. But it doesn't make sense. So when we look back, we think, oh, well, both of those things are more likely to occur in summer. So you're more likely to be swimming in summer, you're more likely to be consuming ice cream in summer. And that is what connects those two factors. And so decreasing your ice cream consumption is not going to decrease your chances of drowning, but consuming ice cream in the winter might. When we look at these giant studies, they're useful in that they observe tens of thousands of people. When we try and establish a causation between two factors, such as the consumption of refined sugars and how many people got diabetes, we have to look at the other factors that could contribute to that relationship. And so these studies are pretty good, and they're not, the scientists that do them are not clueless. They'll look at things like how often the people exercise, how much fiber they consumed, how many fruits and vegetables they were eating. They're going to extrapolate the totality of the data. But one of the things that is problematic is that when we're trying to find out if there's other factors that are causing that correlation or contributing to that correlation, there are so many factors that there's an infinite number of factors, and there are things that our limited knowledge of the body and how it works are going to leave us blind to understand. So for example, what's the state of the microbiome? This is a giant field of research that we're just trying to figure out and sort out and to find out what the link to diseases are. What if the people that consume sugar had a different bacterial makeup that could contribute or not contribute to the risk of diabetes or other diseases? What about their nutritional status, their ability to absorb things like magnesium? If people are consuming a high sugar diet and have adequate levels of magnesium, does that increase their risk of diabetes to the same extent as someone who's consuming a diet that's high in refined sugar and is magnesium deficient? We know that about 40 to 60% of people in North America are not getting enough magnesium. And so is that one of the factors that's contributing to an increased risk of something like diabetes or heart disease? Or we can look at things like their stress, right? So, and reported stress is often not accurate because we're so used to, and you could argue addicted to stress in North America, that we don't really perceive a lot of the stress that we're in. We're sort of like fish in water, right, in terms of the amount of stress that's in our lives. What about their sleep quality? Are they waking up in the middle of the night, and how good is their sleep, and do they even know? Because a lot of people wake up not necessarily feeling rested, but you're kind of used to it. What about the state of their digestive system? Are they absorbing all of the nutrients that are in their diet? What about their inflammation status overall? So there's so many different factors that we need to look at that we're not necessarily looking for when we're assessing the data in these big studies, and that we, to our credit, we don't even really know to look for yet. And the other research methods like randomized control trials and animal studies are also flawed. So animal studies are tightly controlled, so they have an advantage over the epidemiological studies because we're giving mice a specific diet, we're deciding when they exercise, how they exercise, what their context is, and how they're eating. And so they'll be given something like a high lard, high sugar diet to mimic an unhealthy standard North American diet, for example. And of course that has its flaws because in North America we're not just eating lard mixed with sugar, we're eating foods. So even if those foods are essentially lard and sugar, they still are composed of other nutrients that may affect that relationship between the foods that we're eating and the result on our bodies. And then also health context matters. So sometimes that may be the only thing that matters. So we know that barbecuing meat, for example, causes incomplete combustion. It can cause carcinogens and benzenes and things like that in the meat through the process of barbecuing. But when we season the meat with rosemary and jerk spices, some studies are showing that that neutralizes the free radicals that are produced. And so you can't just look at somebody who's consuming barbecued meats and extrapolate whether or not they got sick without looking at the context of whether, which could be as simple as, are they adding seasoning, antioxidant spices to their meats before they're barbecuing them, which is potentially completely reducing the negative impact it could have on their health. So our health context completely matters. And another example is that in a rat study where they were fed that high lard, high fat diet throughout the day, and the mice got sick, they did the study again by only decreasing the feeding window to 12 hours. So the mice were given food for 12 hours and then they were fasted for 12 hours. And the same crappy diet that caused sickness in the mice when they were just fed throughout the day, it had no impact on their health. And so there are so many factors that we need to look at when it comes to food and that are relevant and that may dictate whether or not we get sick. And it's not simply just the foods that we're consuming. So it's very difficult. We're infinitely complex, and in order to study things, we have to know essentially what to look for. And I believe that these studies are getting us closer to the truth, but we're going to sort of flip-flop on our way there. And if we're paying attention to what the research is showing us, then we're going to be in a state of confusion a lot of the time. And we're going to be in a state of worrying about certain things that we're putting into our bodies and avoiding eggs for a period of time and then consuming them, and avoiding things like coconut oil and then consuming it, and on the fence about whether white sugar is as bad for us as it seems, and whether we should completely avoid it or whether we should moderate it in our diet or whether we should just consume it freely. As a naturopathic doctor, I'm not a huge fan of the Canada's Food Guide. There's definitely industry influence in it, and it's often based on a lot of flawed research. The body requires macronutrients and micronutrients, and the macronutrients are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and that's where we get our energy from. And the micronutrients are the vitamins and minerals that help our body perform all of its chemical reactions. There's a man called Ray Cronies, and he's a NASA scientist, and he also does some biohacking, so he experiments with different diets and different lifestyle practices to try and achieve optimal health. So he does those experiments on his own body. And he's outlined his own version of a food pyramid. So one of his arguments is that we don't just eat carbs, fats, and protein. We eat those nutrients in the context of different foods. And we can group foods into different categories based on where they come from. So at the bottom of his pyramid, he has, at the base, there are the animal products, so like meat, fish, eggs, and dairy products. And those are composed primarily of protein. But some of those foods also contain certain levels of fats. On the other side of the pyramid, he has the carbohydrate-dense foods, so the grains and the legumes and the starchy vegetables. And again, some of those things, such as legumes, for example, contain a significant amount of protein, but essentially those foods are mainly composed of carbohydrates and fibers. Then in the middle, we have the fats, so the oils, things like avocado and coconut oil and olive oil, and nuts and seeds. And those are vegetarian foods, vegetable-based foods, but they're distinct from the other categories of foods based on their high fat content. And again, some of those foods contain carbs and contain protein, but they're mainly composed of fat. So none of those foods in each category is essentially a pure carb, fat, or protein. At the very top of the pyramid, he has the non-starchy vegetables, so such as the leafy green vegetables or colorful vegetables. And those are differentiated because while they contain some carbohydrates, they're distinct because of their high micronutrient content. So they contain a lot of vitamins and minerals, such as magnesium and the fat-soluble vitamins and vitamin C and things like that. Ray's argument is that, or what he points out, is that vegetarians tend to focus to the right of the pyramid. So they tend to focus on the more carbohydrate-dense foods, the grains, legumes, seeds, nuts, and some of the fatty foods, and then the vegetables at the top of the pyramid. And the paleo diet tends to focus more on the animal products and the vegetables. And so a lot of our arguments about different diets are what kind of foods do we consume and what's the right balance of foods that we consume at the bottom of the pyramid. And the standard North American diet tends to focus on the bottom of the pyramid. So we tend to overeat the macronutrients, the energy-dense foods, and we tend to undereat the foods that are high in vitamins and minerals. So 70% of North Americans are vitamin D deficient, about 40% of us are magnesium deficient, high number of us are vitamin C deficient, iodine deficient. So we're not getting enough of those micronutrients, but we're perhaps over-consuming the macronutrients, unless we're consciously restricting those foods. So what he says is you should be focusing on the top of the pyramid, so eating as much of the non-starchy vegetables and filling up on those as you can. They're macronutrient sparse, so they don't contain a lot of calories, but they contain a lot of the vitamins and minerals that we're missing out on. And then we should be balancing out the bottom of the pyramid. However, how do we decide how to balance out the bottom of the pyramid? So how do we know how much meat and how many eggs and how much dairy and how much oils and how many legumes are good for us, right? Should we be restricting grains like in a paleo diet? Should we be restricting meat like in a vegan diet? What's the right diet? Should we just be eating only fat and a high fat diet and get into ketosis? So what's sort of the right balance at the bottom? And there's another food pyramid in a book called Healing with Whole Foods. And at the base of this food pyramid, the author Paul Pritchard puts awareness. And the second level is physical activity. And so his argument is that before we even begin to talk about food and filling up our bodies with food, we need to develop a practice of awareness, a foundation of paying attention to our bodies and really even understanding what the cues are in our bodies, right? Because as soon as we start to talk about intuitive eating and awareness and listening to our body's cravings, we start to point out certain imbalances that might be going on, right? So if we're on a blood sugar roller coaster, what are our carbohydrate cravings going to be like when we're experiencing hypoglycemic crashes? If we're suffering from emotional eating, if we have a tendency to emotionally eat, what kinds are our cravings reliable? Are our cravings actually a message from our body that we need more nutrients? Or is it an emotion that we don't want to feel that needs to be covered up? Or is it a way for us to soothe ourselves, which may not necessarily be listening to the messages from the body? And then there's a book called The Dorito Effect, which talks about how a lot of the processed foods and the foods in the food industry that are created by the food industry are processed in such a way that it overrides our cravings and causes us to eat more. So there's the flavoring and the chemicals and the processed seed oils that are added to those foods, the air and the texture and the crunch that causes us to eat more. How do we balance our cravings and how do we understand what our body needs if those kind of foods are in our diet? And so a common thing, this isn't a new idea, but one thing that we talk about is stripping down our food intake to whole foods and feeding our body a variety of different whole foods so that it can learn where it gets its nutrients from and what nutrients to ask for, and what signals to give us in terms of hunger and cravings that send us the message of what we need more of. And a lot of patients who follow a whole foods diet will tell me that they crave things like broccoli and Brussels sprouts or oranges or foods that are dense in certain micronutrients that their body may be asking for in order to establish its balance. Michael Pollan, that a lot of you may know, the author of the Omnivores Dilemma, and he tells us to eat food, not too much, mostly plants, right? So to focus mainly on food and not those edible food-like products like Doritos that have been engineered to get us to crave them. So he tells us to, eat foods that if they come in a package contain less than 5 ingredients, that you can kind of tell where they were derived in nature, right? You can tell what animal they probably came from, what tree they may have grown on if they came from the ground. So you're sort of sticking to the periphery of the grocery store and giving your body a variety of those foods, essentially cleaning and wiping off the smog from the window that may be clouding the body's perceptions of what kind of foods it needs, as well as looking at emotional eating tendencies and food sensitivities, and as well as balancing out the body if you were going through a period of restriction, right? So a lot of us that are doing very restrictive diets potentially overeat the thing that we were restricting if we introduce it in without increasing or establishing that foundation of awareness and mindful eating. So I tend to think of that more than than trying to separate foods into categories of good or bad foods, especially when they're whole foods, right? So coconut oil, I believe that if we're eating a whole foods diet and we're adding coconut oil to our diet, our body will tell us how much fat it needs. It'll start to crave coconut oil. It'll feel satiated if we eat too much coconut oil. Our hunger and our cravings, perhaps, will tell us what the right ratio of fats to proteins to carbs to micronutrients and fiber we need. So this isn't a perfect science, right? And it involves a lot of awareness and mindfulness and a practice in intuitive eating. And what happens if our body is out of balance? So what happens if we do have insulin resistance, right? Like in my patients who are experiencing PCOS or prediabetes or diabetes, or my patients with depression and anxiety and IBS that may be experiencing gut inflammation, right? What if we're consistently eating a food that we're sensitive to causing gut inflammation, which then causes endorphin release, which then causes us to become addicted to those endorphins and that dopamine that we're getting in response to the inflammation that then is causing us to crave those foods. So what if we're in that kind of state? Can we really trust our cravings and our hunger signal? And so sometimes I do believe therapeutically it can be beneficial to do a period of restriction, right? And so I am a big fan of the elimination diet. We're looking at IgG sensitivity testing. And the severity of someone's symptoms is going to dictate the severity or the invasiveness of our treatment, right? Because even a restrictive diet or even a specific therapeutic diet is going to have some level of invasiveness in that it's going to cause you to change your lifestyle in a way that is not super convenient. So, we'll do things where we'll have people write out a diet diary and we'll look at certain foods that they may be reacting to if there's some inflammation going on. We may do a trial where we lower the inflammation by removing that food. And we can remove that food temporarily and reintroduce it and see if we can elicit a reaction again. And sometimes people find that if they moderate the quality of the food being reintroduced and the quantity, that they can have it in moderation again. So a good example of this is a lot of people who are sensitive to gluten, if they heal the gut and then reintroduce gluten in whole forms, like in fermented sourdough bread, that they can tolerate it. Or if they're going out for pizza once a week or once a month, they can tolerate that pretty well. But if they start to increase their consumption of gluten to a daily degree or daily frequency, then they start to get side effects again. And sometimes people notice that that's a food that they can't tolerate anymore. And so these elimination diets just provide us with information. Or if we're trying to reestablish our insulin and our hormonal regulation, then sometimes doing periodic lower carbohydrate diets may be beneficial. And some people may figure out what the carbohydrate consumption level their body needs is through doing these periods of restriction. So there are a few elements to this, right? One is to consume a whole foods diet and to not necessarily limit the different foods, like the different fats and foods that contain cholesterol and naturally occurring salt and naturally occurring sugars, right? Like honey and prunes and dates and fruits and things like that, as opposed to the refined table sugar. And to avoid sort of foods that have been modified and processed, and to see what the body tells you in terms of what it needs and what it wants and what it prefers. Then there's working with a professional to establish a therapeutic eating pattern that may be right for you, and to establish a foundation of mindfulness that allows us to tune into the cues of the body, to listen to our hunger signals and our craving signals, to figure out if those cravings are physical or emotional, and to align our actions based on that.